Story 1. Camp Nordland. I found the old photographs while cleaning out my grandfather in his basement in Andover, New Jersey. Black and white images from the 1930s showing children in matching uniforms, standing in neat rows beneath swastika banners. The handwriting on the back read, Camp Nordland, summer 1938. My grandfather had never mentioned living near a Nazi camp, never talked about the German-American Bund or their twisted summer retreats. But there it was in his own careful script, documenting something history books barely remembered. The photos showed kids my own son, his age, learning to march, saluting flags that made my stomach turn. But what disturbed me most was recognizing the location. Those woods, that lake, the distinctive rock formation in the background. I hiked those trails dozens of times. The place was now called Hillside Park, a quiet nature preserve where families went camping. Something about finding those photos in my grandfather's basement felt like discovering a family secret I wasn't supposed to know. Why had he kept them? What was his connection to a place that trained American children to worship Hitler? I drove out to Hillside Park that weekend, telling myself I just wanted to see how much had changed. The main trails were well maintained, marked with cheerful wooden signs about local wildlife. But if you knew where to look, if you wandered off the beaten path, you could still find remnants. Concrete foundations hidden under decades of leaf litter, metal fragments that might have been flagpoles or fence posts, and deeper in the woods, where casual hikers never ventured, the remains of actual buildings. The first cabin I found was barely standing, rotted logs held together by rust and stubborn ivy, but the structure was unmistakable. This had been this summer home once, part of a community that celebrated the worst ideology humanity ever produced. I pushed through the collapsed doorframe, using my phone's flashlight to navigate the debris. The interior was mostly empty, claimed by decades of weather and neglect. But carved into one wall, still visible beneath peeling paint and mold, were symbols that made my skin crawl. Not just swastikas, but names and dates. Children's names scratched into the wood like any summer camp memento. Except these kids had been learning to hate, being molded into perfect little fascists while their parents convinced themselves they were preserving their heritage. I took pictures, documenting everything. Part of me felt like I was disturbing a grave, but another part knew this needed to be recorded. These ruins were a reminder of how easily evil could take root in American soil, disguised as patriotism and tradition. The second cabin was in better shape, its roof still intact enough to create pockets of deep shadow. Inside, I found something that stopped me cold. A wooden chest, hidden beneath decades of accumulated debris, containing items that shouldn't have survived this long in the elements. Books in German, their pages yellow but readable. Propaganda materials featuring American children pledging allegiance to foreign flags. And photographs. Hundreds of photographs showing the camp in its prime. These weren't tourist snapshots or family memories. These were official documentation, records of indoctrination, evidence of systematic child abuse disguised as summer fun. I recognized some of the faces from my grandfather's collection, but these showed more. Much more. The final photos in the chest were different. Taken at night, illuminated by torchlight and bonfire glow. They showed ceremonies that went beyond simple political rallies. Rituals that borrowed from older, darker traditions, mixing Nazi symbolism with something that felt almost occult. I was so absorbed in the photographs that I didn't notice the sun setting. By the time I looked up from the chest, the woods had grown dark around me. My phone battery was nearly dead from using the flashlight, and I wandered much deeper into the forest than I intended. Getting lost in familiar woods is a special kind of disorientation. Every tree looks the same in the dark. Every path seems to lead in circles. But what made it worse was the feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. Footsteps that matched mine too perfectly. Branches breaking in rhythm with my movement. I tried to convince myself it was echo effects or my imagination. But then I started hearing voices. Not modern voices, but the cadence of German being spoken by American children. Distant but clear, like audio from an old recording playing somewhere in the trees. The voices led me to a clearing I didn't remember seeing on any park map. A circular space where the grass grew differently, where the trees formed an almost perfect ring. In the center stood a flagpole, rusted but still upright, still flying tattered remnants of fabric that might once have been red, white, and black. That is when I understood why my grandfather had kept those photographs. not as a collector or historian, but as documentation of his own participation. The handwriting I recognized wasn't just his script. It was his signature on attendance records, his name on cabin assignments. My grandfather hadn't lived near Camp Nordland. He'd been a camper there. The realization hit me like cold water. Everything I thought I knew about my family history crumbled in that moment. The man who taught me to tie knots and identify bird calls had once been a child trained to hate anyone who didn't look like us. But the worst part was yet to come. The voices in the clearing grew louder, more distinct. I could make out individual words now, children reciting pledges in broken German, promising loyalty to ideals that would soon plunge the world into war. And mixed in with those long-dead voices, I heard something impossible. My own voice, adult, present, joining the recitation. I was speaking words I didn't, in a language I never learned. But somehow the syllables felt familiar on my tongue. Like muscle memory inherited across generations, passed down through blood and family stories that were never told. The photographs in my hands began to change. The faces in the images shifting, aging, becoming people I recognized. My grandfather as a young man, standing proud in uniform. My father as a child, visiting the camp years later when it briefly reopened under different names. And in the most recent photos, impossible as it seemed, I saw myself. Standing in this same clearing, holding this same chest, speaking these same words. The camp had never really closed. It had just learned to hide better, to work through families instead of institutions. Each generation carrying forward what they learned, whether they realized it or not. I dropped the chest and ran, crashed through underbrush and ignored branches tearing at my clothes. By the time I reached my car, I was bleeding from dozens of cuts and my hands were shaking so badly I could barely start the engine. I drove home and burned everything. The photographs, the books, even the pictures I'd taken with my phone. But you can burn memories, and you can unlearn things about your own blood. Sometimes, late at night, I catch myself humming songs I remember learning. Simple melodies that feel like lullabies, but with words in German that I somehow understand perfectly. The camp is still out there, hidden in plain sight as a family park. And every generation, someone finds those old cabins, discovers that chest, and learns the truth about what their family really passed down. The scariest part about evil ISN, that it exists. It is how easily it disguises itself as tradition, how smoothly it passes from parent to child, how normal it feels when it's all you've ever known. I worry about my son sometimes. Wonder what songs I might have hummed to him as a baby. What stories I might have told without realizing their true meaning. Because the most terrifying monsters, Aaron, the ones hiding under beds. They were the ones sitting at family dinner tables, teaching children to carry forward darkness they don't even recognize as wrong. Story 2. Memory thief. My 5-year-old stepson knew about my dead cat. That is not something a child should know. Hell, that is not something anyone should know. I never told my wife about Rusty. Never told anyone about that red Camaro either, or the apartment on Maple Street where I lived before I met her. But there was little Jake, sitting at our kitchen table on a Tuesday morning, telling me about them like he lived my life himself. I miss my orange kitty, he said, stirring his cereal with a plastic spoon. The one that got hit by the blue truck. I nearly choked on my coffee. What orange kitty? Buddy, the one from when I lived in the red car house. Before I was Jake, when I was the sad man who cried about the kitty. My hands started shaking. Rusty had been orange, and I cried for weeks after that delivery truck took him. But I lived alone then, in that studio apartment 3 states away, 5 years before I even met Sarah. There was no way this kid could know. Tell me about the red car house, Jake. He looked up at me with those big brown eyes, so serious for a 5-year-old. It was shiny red and fast, made loud noises. I loved that car, but I was always sad because the kitty died and I was all alone. Then I got sick and everything went dark, and then I was born and became Jake. The room felt like it was tilting. That Camaro had been my pride and joy. I bought it right after college, before the recession hit and I had to sell everything. Before the depression that followed. Before the cancer diagnosis that I'd beaten but never discussed with anyone. I excused myself and called in sick to work. Spent the day researching, trying to find some rational explanation. Kids have wild imaginations, right? Maybe he overheard something. Maybe Sarah knew more than she didn't let on. But when I asked her that evening, she looked at me like I'd grown a second head. Honey, Jake has never even seen a red sports car in person. And what is this about a cat? You told me you were allergic. That's when the real fear set in. I wasn't allergic. I just never wanted another pet after losing Rusty. The lie had been so automatic, I'd forgotten I told it. The next morning, Jake was at it again. I remember the place with all the white beds, he said, drawing with his crayons. Where the people in green clothes stuck needles in my arm. They said the bad cells were winning, but I wasn't ready to go yet. He was drawing stick figures in what looked like a hospital room. One figure was lying down with tubes coming out of it. The other figures wore what could only be described as scrubs. Jake, where do you think you learned about hospitals? From when I was sick before. Before I came here, the doctors tried to fix me, but I got too tired and had to leave. Then I found you and Mommy and came back. I snatched the drawing before Sarah could see it. The detail was impossible for a kid his age. He drawn IV stands, heart monitors, even what looked like a chemotherapy drip. Things no 5-year-old should know about unless they experience them. That afternoon, while Jake napped, I drove to the town records office. I needed to know if anyone had died around the time Jake was born. Someone who might have owned a red Camaro. Someone who lost an orange cat. Someone who fought cancer and lost. The clerk was helpful but puzzled. Sir, we don't really keep those kinds of detailed records about personal belongings or pets. What exactly are you looking for? I couldn't explain without sounding insane. But I convinced her to let me look through the obituaries from 5 years ago, around Jake's birth date. Most were elderly folks, a few accidents, the usual small-town tragedies. Then I found it. David Michael Chen, age 28, died of complications from acute leukemia at St. Mary's General Hospital. The obituary mentioned his love of classic cars and his grief over losing his beloved cat, Rusty, just months before his diagnosis. David Chen had lived at 423 Maple Street, apartment 3B. My old address. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the paper. But it got worse. There was a photo. David Chen looked exactly like I had at 28. Not similar, identical, same face, same build, same crooked smile. We could have been twins. But David Chen had died 6 months before I moved to Maple Street. Before I bought that red Camaro. Before I adopted Rusty from the shelter. Which meant either I was losing my mind, or something impossible was happening in my house. I raced home to find Jake sitting in the living room, staring out the window with that same serious expression. You found out about David, didn't you? He said without turning around. My blood turned to ice water. How do you know that name? Because that is who I was before. David was sad and sick and alone. But David's memories needed somewhere to go when he died. So they waited until I was born and came to live in my head. He finally turned to look at me, and for a split second, I swear his eyes looked older. Ancient, like they'd seen things no child should see. But David's memories are getting stronger. Sometimes I forget I am Jake. Sometimes I think I'm still David and you. Or just some stranger living my life. Using my apartment, driving my car, taking care of my cat. Jake, David died before I ever lived there. Before I got any of those things. He smiled, but it wasn't the child's smile. Did he? Or did David's memories just find a way to make them happen again? Make everything exactly the same so he could feel at home? The room felt like it was spinning. That's not possible. Then explain how you ended up in his exact apartment. How you bought the same car. How you adopted a cat that looked just like Rusty and gave him the same name. How you got sick with the same cancer but somehow beat it when David couldn't. I opened my mouth to argue, but the words wouldn't come. Because when I really thought about it, all those choices had felt automatic. Natural, like I was following some invisible script. David, his memories are patient, Jake continued, his voice taking on an eerie calm. They waited until you lived his life completely, until you experienced everything he did, until you became him in every way that mattered. Now they were ready to come home. What are you talking about? Jake stood up and walked toward me, but his movements were wrong. Too measured, too adult. Tonight, when you go to sleep, David, his memories will be complete. They will take back what was always theirs. And Jake will fade away, just like David did, just like you will. You, re-scaring me, buddy. I'm not your buddy, he said, and his voice was deeper now, older. am David Chen, and I want my life back. The lights flickered. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in seconds. And when Jake smiled again, I saw David's crooked grin looking back at me. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't to move. Tried to scream, but no sound came. The room was fading around the edges, like an old photograph burning. The last thing I remember is Jake's voice, echoing from somewhere far away. Thanks for keeping my memories safe. Thanks for living my life until I was ready to take it back. When I woke up this morning, I was 5 years old again. My name is Jake now, and I live with my mommy and my new daddy. He seems nice, but sometimes I remember things that scare me. Things about being grown up and living alone and losing everything I loved. But don't worry about me. I'm sure these memories will fade soon. Just like David's did. Just like yours will too, when it's your turn to remember who you really are. Story 3. Black-eyed children. The knock on my door came at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday night in suburban Phoenix. And when I looked through the peephole, I saw 2 children standing on my porch. They couldn't have been older than 10 or 12. A boy and a girl wearing clothes that looked like they hadn't been washed in weeks. But something about them made every instinct in my body scream at me not to open that door. Their eyes were completely black. Not just the pupils, but the entire eye, like someone had filled their sockets with thick oil that reflected nothing. And they were staring directly at the peephole, as if they could see me watching them. I am a night shift security guard at a warehouse complex, so I'm used to being awake at odd hours. I had just gotten home from work and was settling in with a beer when the knocking started. 3 soft taps, then a pause, then 3 more. Polite but persistent, like whoever was out there knew I was home and would wait all night if necessary. Living alone in a quiet neighborhood, you don't expect visitors after midnight. My first thought was that something had happened to one of my neighbors, that these kids needed help. But when I saw those eyes, that thought died instantly. The girl raised her hand and knocked again, the same pattern. 3 taps, pause, 3 more. Through the door, I could hear her speaking, though her lips barely moved. Her voice was flat, monotone, like she was reading from a script she memorized but didn't understand. She said they needed to come inside, said they were lost and their parents were worried, said they just needed to use the phone to call home. All perfectly reasonable requests that any decent person would help with. But her eyes, those solid black eyes that seemed to absorb light instead of reflecting it. I stepped away from the door and grabbed my cell phone, thinking I'd call the police and let them handle whatever this was. But when I looked at the screen, I had no signal. Full bars just minutes earlier. Now nothing. The landline was dead too. No dial tone when I picked up the receiver. The knocking came again, more insistent now. The boy's voice joined the girl. Yes, both of them speaking in that same emotionless monotone. They needed to come in. They were cold and scared. They promised they wouldn't cause any trouble. But underneath their words was something else, a sound I felt more than heard. Like static electricity building before a thunderstorm, or the low hum of power lines on a humid day. It made my teeth ache and my vision blur around the edges. I looked through the peephole again and immediately wished I hadn't. They were closer now, standing right against the door, close enough that I could see details that made my hands shake. Their skin was pale, almost gray in the porch light. Their clothes, while dirty, looked like they came from different decades. The girl wore a dress that might have been popular in the 1980s, while the boy's shirt and shorts looked even older, like something from a vintage photograph. But it was their stillness that really got to me. They didn't fidget or shift their weight like normal kids would. They stood perfectly motionless, like mannequins, only their mouths moving as they repeated their requests to come inside. I backed away from the door and tried to think rationally. Kids playing pranks, maybe. Contact lenses that made their eyes look black. Some kind of elaborate joke or dare that would make sense in the morning. But every fiber of my being was telling me that these weren't ordinary children. Weren't children at all, despite their appearance. There was something predatory about the way they stood there, something patient and calculating that no 10-year-old should possess. The knocking stopped. For several minutes, my house was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic on the highway. I started to relax, thinking they moved on to bother someone else. Maybe I overreacted. Maybe they really were just lost kids with some kind of medical condition that affected their eyes. Then I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate footsteps walking around the perimeter of my house. They paused at each window, and I could feel eyes watching me even though I kept the curtains closed. The footsteps moved methodically from room to room, as if the children were mapping out my home, learning its layout for future reference. I followed the sounds from inside, staying well back from the windows. In the kitchen, the footsteps stopped right outside the sliding glass door that leads to my back patio. I could see shadows moving beyond the curtains, 2 small figures standing perfectly still. Then came the tapping on the glass, the same pattern as before. 3 taps, pause. 3 more. The girl's voice drifted through the door, muffled but clear. She said they knew I was afraid, but there was no reason to be. They just wanted to come inside where it was warm. They promised they were harmless. But there was something in her tone now that hadn't been there before. A subtle change that suggested her patience was wearing thin. The politeness was still there, but underneath it was something cold and hungry. I grabbed a flashlight from my kitchen drawer and shined it through the gap in the curtains. The beam illuminated the patio, but there was nothing there. No children, no shadows, nothing but empty concrete and the lawn chairs I'd forgotten to bring in before winter. But the tapping continued, as if invisible hands were knocking on the glass right in front of me. I stumbled backward and knocked over a kitchen chair, the crash echoing through the house like a gunshot. The tapping stopped immediately, and the silence that followed was somehow worse than the knocking had been. That is when I noticed my reflection in the microwave door. Behind me, barely visible in the distorted surface, were 2 small figures standing in my kitchen. I spun around, but nothing was there. The kitchen was empty except for me and the overturned chair. But when I looked back at the microwave, the reflection showed them clearly. The boy and girl with their black eyes and decade-old clothes, standing right behind me, close enough that I should have been able to feel their breath. The girl raised her hand in the reflection and waved. I ran to my bedroom and slammed the door, turning the deadbolt I installed after a break-in 2 years earlier. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely work my phone, but I managed to dial 911. The call wouldn't connect. The phone showed full signal strength, but every attempt to make a call failed. Outside my bedroom window, I could hear them talking to each other in voices so low I couldn't make out words. But the tone was different now. Discussing something, making plans. The polite pretense was gone, replaced by something that sounded almost businesslike. I checked the time on my phone, 12:33 a.m. Less than an hour since this had started, but it felt like I'd been trapped in my own house for days. The voices outside stopped, and once again my house fell silent. I waited in my bedroom for 3 hours, sitting in the corner farthest from the window, clutching a baseball bat I kept under my bed. Every few minutes I'd check my phone, hoping for a signal, hoping the nightmare would end. But the call still wouldn't connect, and the clock seemed to be moving slower than it should. At 3:30 a.m., I finally worked up the courage to look outside. The street was empty except for a single figure standing under the streetlight across from my house. An adult this time, a woman in a long coat that covered most of her body. She was looking directly at my bedroom window, and even from that distance, even in the dim light, I could see that her eyes were solid black. She raised her hand and pointed at me, then turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows between houses. The spell, whatever it was, seemed to break. My phone immediately connected to 911, and I found myself trying to explain to a dispatcher that 2 children with black eyes had been trying to get into my house. It sounded insane even as I said it, and I could hear the skepticism in the dispatcher's voice. The police arrived 20 minutes later, 2 officers who walked the perimeter of my house and found nothing unusual. No footprints, no signs of disturbance, nothing to indicate that anyone had been there at all. They took a report and advised me to call if the kids came back, but I could tell they thought I'd been drinking or having some kind of episode. After they left, I spent the rest of the night researching black-eyed children online. I found hundreds of similar stories from all over the country. Kids with solid black eyes appearing at doors and car windows. Always polite, always asking to be let in, always filling witnesses with an overwhelming sense of dread. Most people who encounter them refuse to let them inside, but a few stories mention what happens to those who do. Houses found empty the next day, their occupants simply gone without a trace. No signs of struggle, no evidence of what happened, just empty homes with doors left standing open. The black-eyed children have been reported for decades, maybe longer. Some researchers think they supernatural entities, demons or ghosts that take the form of children to seem less threatening. Others believe they be something else entirely, beings from another dimension or reality that occasionally slip through cracks in our world. But everyone who has encountered them agrees on one thing: you never, ever let them inside. I moved out of that house 3 weeks later. Couldn't stand being there after dark. Couldn't shake the feeling that they were still watching, still waiting for me to lower my guard. I found a new place across town, an apartment on the 3rd floor of a building with security doors and cameras. For 2 months, I thought I was safe. Last night, I was awakened by soft knocking on my apartment door. 3 taps, pause, 3 more. When I looked through the peephole, I saw 2 children standing in the hallway. Different faces this time, but the same black eyes, the same unnaturally still posture. The girl spoke in that flat, emotionless voice I remembered so well. She said they'd been looking for me. Said they knew I'd moved, but they finally found me. Said they just wanted to come in and talk. They were still out there in the hallway. I could hear them whispering to each other, planning something. The other tenants walk right past them like they were invisible, like only I can see them. My lease is up next month, and I am already looking for another place to live. But I have a feeling no matter where I go, they've marked me somehow, chosen me for reasons I can. Do you understand? The knocking is starting again. 3 taps, pause, 3 more. And this time, I'm not sure how long my door will keep them out. Story 4. Wrong number. I should have known something was wrong when my dead wife texted me at 3 in the morning. The phone buzzed on my nightstand, pulling me from restless sleep in my empty Denver apartment. Sarah, his name glowed on the screen, and for one impossible moment, my heart forgot she'd been gone for 8 months. The accident, the funeral, the grief counseling sessions where I learned to say was instead of is when talking about her. But there it was, her contact photos smiling back at me. That picture from our Yellowstone trip where she insisted on taking selfies by every geyser. The message was simple. Hey, Benny, can T sleep? Missing our late night talks. Benny, she called me that since high school, 20 years ago. Everyone called me Ben now. Sarah always called me honey, or babe, or when she was feeling playful, Benjamin Franklin because of my obsession with budgeting apps. Never Benny. My hands shook as I stared at the screen. The rational part of my mind knew this had to be some cruel mistake. Maybe a delayed message finally pushing through the cell towers. Technology glitches happened all the time. But at 3 a.m., alone in our apartment that still smelled faintly of her vanilla perfume, rational thought felt as distant as daylight. I typed back, Sarah. The response came instantly. Of course it was me, silly. Who else would have this number? My chest tightened. This wasn't right. Sarah's phone had been destroyed in the crash, crushed along with everything else in her Honda Accord when that semi ran the red light on Colfax Avenue. I'd been there when the police handed me her personal effects in a clear plastic bag, wallet, wedding ring, and twisted metal that used to be an iPhone. But here I was, having a conversation with her number. Where are you? I typed, my thumb hovering over the send button for a full minute before I found the courage to press it. Close by. I've been watching you, Ben. You not taking care of yourself. The use of my real name felt worse than Benny somehow. More deliberate, like whatever was on the other end had corrected itself, learned from my reaction. I set the phone down and walked to my living room window, peering through the blinds at the empty street below. Nothing moved except the skeletal branches of the elm tree Sarah had planted our first spring in this place. When I picked up the phone again, there were 3 new messages waiting. You haven't been eating enough. That cereal for dinner again last night wasn't too healthy. I worry about you when you stay up so late scrolling through our photos. Ice water filled my veins. No one could know those things. I lived alone. My nearest neighbor, Mrs. Chen, was deaf as a post and minded her own business. The apartment complex was quiet, filled mostly with graduate students and young professionals who kept to themselves. More importantly, I never told anyone about my pathetic routine. How I survived the past 8 months on Lucky Charms and takeout Chinese food. How I'd fallen asleep most nights with my laptop open, cycling through our digital memories until my eyes burned. I typed with trembling fingers. How do you know that? I know everything about you. Ben, I know you kept my coffee mug on the counter even though it's been dirty for 3 weeks. I know you wear my Northwestern sweatshirt when you watch Netflix. I know you still say goodnight to my pillow. The phone slipped from my hands and clattered to the hardwood floor. Everything she mentioned was true, down to embarrassing details I never shared with anyone. Not my brother Mike. Not my therapist Dr. Rodriguez. Not even my mother during our awkward weekly check-in calls. I scrambled to pick up the device and saw one more message had arrived. Look outside your bedroom window. Every instinct screamed at me to ignore it, to delete these messages and pretend this nightmare conversation had never happened. But grief does strange things to logic. The desperate, aching part of me that missed Sarah more than oxygen couldn't resist the possibility, however impossible, that somehow she was really out there. I crept to the bedroom window, the same one where Sarah used to sit with her morning coffee, watching the sunrise paint the mountains purple and gold. My hands shook as I lifted the blinds. The parking lot stretched empty below, illuminated by harsh sodium lights that turned everything the color of old bones. My Subaru sat alone in spot 47, covered in a thin layer of October frost. Nothing moved. Then my phone buzzed again. Third floor. Apartment 3C. Look closer. Apartment 3C was directly across from mine in the U-shaped complex. I never paid attention to who lived there, but now I could see a figure silhouetted in the window. Tall, slender, with long dark hair, the exact shape of my wife. The figure raised one hand in a slow, deliberate wave. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over Sarah, this reading chair that I couldn't bring myself to move. When I looked again, the window was empty, but my phone was buzzing with a new message. I need to see you, Ben. I need to explain. Explain what? I typed back, surprised by my own boldness. Why I had to leave. Where I've been. Why I couldn't contact you until now. You died, Sarah. You died in a car accident 8 months ago. Did I? Are you sure about that? The question hit me like a physical blow. Of course I was sure. I identified her body at the morgue, though the crash had left her so broken that I only recognized her by the small scar on her wrist from when she'd fallen off her bike as a kid. I planned her funeral, picked out her casket, watched them lower her into the ground at Riverside Cemetery. But seeds of doubt, planted by grief and watered by desperate hope, began to sprout in the dark corners of my mind. What if there had been a mistake? What if somehow, impossibly, she survived? Meet me downstairs, came the next message. By the mailboxes. We need to talk. I knew I shouldn't. To go. Every horror movie I ever watched had taught me that much. But this wasn't some stranger luring me into danger. This was Sarah, my Sarah, who made me grilled cheese sandwiches when I had the flu, who danced with me in our kitchen to songs only she could hear, who promised me forever on a beach in Hawaii while waves crashed behind us. I grabbed my keys and headed for the door, then stopped. Something felt wrong beyond the obvious impossibility of the situation. I couldn't pinpoint what exactly, but some primal warning system was firing in my brain. My phone buzzed. What's taking so long? I've been waiting. Then, seconds later, please, Ben. I don't have much time. I opened my door and stepped into the hallway, fluorescent lights humming overhead like dying insects. The elevator seemed too risky somehow, too enclosed, so I took the stairs. Each footstep echoed in the concrete stairwell, and I found myself moving as quietly as possible, though I couldn't say why. The lobby was empty except for the usual collection of takeout menus and Amazon packages by the mailboxes. I pushed through the glass doors and stepped into the cold October air, my breath forming small clouds that dissipated into the darkness. Sarah, I called softly, feeling foolish. A figure emerged from the shadows between two parked cars. In the dim light, she looked exactly like my wife. Same height, same build, same way of holding her shoulders slightly hunched when she was cold. She wore the blue dress I buried her in. Hello, Ben, she said, and her voice was perfect. Every inflection, every subtle accent from her childhood in Michigan. I missed you so much. She stepped closer, and I could see her face clearly now. It was Sarah's face, but something was wrong with it. The features were right, but they sat slightly off, like a photograph that had been adjusted but not quite aligned properly. Her smile was too wide, showing too many teeth. You were not Sarah, I whispered. Of course I am. Who else would I be? I don't know what you are, but you were not my wife. Her expression didn't change, but something shifted in her eyes. The warmth drained out of them, leaving behind something cold and calculating. But I know everything about her. Every memory, every secret. I can love you exactly the way she did. How is that possible? Does it matter? I am here now. We can be together again. She reached for me, and I saw that her hands were wrong too. The fingers were too long, the skin too pale, the nails painted in a shade of red Sarah never wore. When she moved, her joints seemed to bend in ways that weren't quite human. I backed away, and her face began to change. The features shifted and flowed like melting wax, cycling through variations of Sarah's appearance. Some were close to perfect. Others were obviously wrong, as if something was adjusting itself, trying to find the right combination. "I am still learning," it said in Sarah's voice. "But I am getting better. Soon you want to be able to tell the difference." "Learning from what?" "Your phone, Ben. Every photo, every text, every video, your social media posts, your emails, your search history. You built such a detailed digital portrait of her. That made my job so much easier." The thing that looked like Sarah smiled, and I realized with growing horror that it was right. Every night for 8 months, I fed my grief with digital memories, scrolling through thousands of photos and messages, watching videos of her laughing, reading her old emails and social media posts over and over again. I'd been teaching it how to be her. "What do you want?" I asked. "To live, Ben. To exist in the world instead of just in the spaces between signals. And you were going to help me." I'll never help you. You already have. Every time you responded to my messages, every time you looked at my picture, every time you wished I was still here, you made me stronger. You gave me form." It stepped closer, and I could smell something wrong beneath the familiar scent of Sarah's perfume. Something like ozone and copper, the smell of electrical storms and old blood. All I need now is to take her place completely. In your life, in your memories, in your heart. And the only way to do that is to make sure you never doubt me again. I turned and ran, my feet slipping on the frost-covered pavement. Behind me, I could hear it calling out in Sarah's voice, pleading, crying, begging me to come back. But underneath her words, I caught something else. A sound like static, like the hiss between radio stations, like the digital artifacts that creep into compressed audio files. I made it to my apartment and locked the door, though I knew that wouldn't stop something that could mimic text messages from a destroyed phone. My hands shook as I grabbed my laptop and started deleting everything. Every photo, every video, every trace of Sarah I hoarded like a dragon guarding treasure. But it was too late. My phone buzzed with a final message. "Thank you, Ben. I couldn't have done this without you." The message showed as coming from my own number. I threw the phone against the wall, watching it shatter into pieces, but I knew it didn't matter. The thing had learned enough, absorbed enough, become enough. Somewhere out there in the digital spaces between cell towers and Wi-Fi signals, it was growing stronger, more complete. That was 6 months ago. I've moved 3 times since then, changed my number, deleted all my social media accounts. I pay for everything in cash and avoid cameras when I can. But sometimes, late at night, I still get messages from numbers I don't recognize. They know things only Sarah would know. They remember conversations only we shared. They were getting better at being her, more convincing with every attempt. And the worst part, sometimes I find myself wanting to respond. Because even a digital ghost wearing my wife's face is better than the emptiness she left behind. If you get a text from someone you love, someone who should be gone, to answer it. To give it what it needs to become real. Some doors should stay closed, even when they dressed up like the people we miss most. Story 5. Whispering Pines. My compass started spinning the moment I stepped off the trail into what locals call the Whispering Pines. I should have turned back right then. Any experienced hiker knows a malfunctioning compass in dense forest is a death sentence, especially in the remote corners of Washington's Olympic Peninsula. But I was desperate to find my brother Jake, and the search teams had given up 3 days ago. The forest felt wrong from the beginning. Not dangerous wrong, like a bear might be watching from the shadows. This was something deeper, older, the kind of wrongness that settles into your bones and makes you question every decision that brought you to this place. Jake had been hiking alone when he disappeared, something he'd been doing more often since his divorce. His ex-wife Karen had called me in Seattle, her voice breaking as she explained how he'd been talking about ending things, about how everyone would be better off without him. The park rangers found his truck at the Sorrow Creek trailhead, but no trace of Jake beyond that. The Whispering Pines earned its name from the constant sound of wind through the dense canopy, even on still days. Local Native American tribes had avoided this particular grove for centuries, claiming it was cursed. Early settlers reported strange disappearances, and by the 1950s, the area had developed a reputation as a place people went when they didn't want to be found. What the tourists don't know is that 12 people had vanished in these woods over the past 5 years. The authorities called them suicides, though they rarely found bodies, just abandoned belongings, sometimes arranged in neat piles beneath towering Douglas firs that seemed to lean inward, creating a cathedral of shadows. My GPS died 20 minutes into the forest, the screen flickering once before going black. The temperature dropped noticeably as I pushed deeper into the undergrowth, though afternoon sunlight still filtered through the canopy above. Every step felt heavier than the last, as if the earth itself was trying to hold me back. The silence was the worst part. No birdsong, no rustle of small animals, no buzz of insects. Just that endless whispering of wind through pine needles, a sound that began to resemble voices if I listened too closely. Fragments of conversations, pleas, warnings that dissolved into static whenever I tried to focus on them. I found the first pile of belongings an hour into my search. A red backpack, expensive hiking boots, and a smartphone with a cracked screen. The items were arranged in a perfect circle around the base of an ancient pine, like some kind of offering. The tree, whose bark was scarred with what looked like claw marks, though they were too high up to have been made by any animal I knew. My own phone showed no signal, no GPS, just a black screen that reflected my increasingly worried face. The forest seemed to be closing in around me, branches hanging lower, trunks growing closer together. I'd been walking in a straight line, or thought I had. But somehow I kept encountering the same fallen log, the same distinctive boulder, the same clearing where the light fell in sickly yellow shafts. That is when I heard Jake's voice. It came from deeper in the forest, faint but unmistakably his voice calling my name. Relief flooded through me, followed immediately by confusion. Jake sounded different somehow, hollow, like he was calling from the bottom of a well. I followed the sound, pushing through thick undergrowth that left scratches on my arms and face. The voice led me to a grove where the trees grew in an almost perfect circle, their branches intertwined overhead to block out most of the sky. In the center sat a man who looked exactly like my brother, but something was terribly wrong with his eyes. They were empty, reflecting nothing, as if someone had hollowed him out and left only the shell. I called out to him, but he didn't respond. Just sat there with his back against a massive pine, staring at nothing with those dead eyes. When I got closer, I could see that his lips were moving, but no sound was coming out. He was mouthing words, the same phrase over and over. It's easier here. It's easier here. I reached out to touch his shoulder, and my hand passed right through him like he was made of morning mist. The figure of Jake looked up at me then, and for a moment his eyes seemed to focus. His mouth opened in a silent scream before he faded away completely, leaving only the smell of pine needles and something else underneath it, something like decay. That is when I understood what the Whispering Pines really was. Not just a place where people came to die, but a place that kept them, trapped them in their final moments of despair. Every soul who had ended their life here remained, caught in an endless loop of their last thoughts, their deepest pain echoing through the trees forever. The whispers weren't wind. They were voices, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, stretching back generations. All the lost, the desperate, the forgotten, calling out from the spaces between the trees. And they wanted company. I felt it then, the weight that had been pressing down on me since I entered the forest. It wasn't just the eeriness of the place. It was something more insidious. A creeping sense of hopelessness, of worthlessness, of crushing loneliness that seemed to seep up from the forest floor like fog. The trees themselves were whispering, not just with wind, but with the collected despair of everyone who had ever died here. My phone buzzed back to life in my pocket, showing dozens of missed messages from Karen, from my parents, from friends wondering where I was. But instead of relief, I felt only irritation. What did any of it matter? What was I even trying to accomplish here? Jake was gone, had chosen to be gone, and maybe he had the right idea. I sat down heavily on the same fallen log I had passed 3 times before, and realized I could stay here. Just rest for a while, let the forest take care of everything. The whispers grew louder, more welcoming, promising peace from the constant struggle of living, working, pretending everything was fine when nothing ever really was. The trees leaned closer, their shadows growing longer despite the fact that the light never seemed to change in this place. I could feel myself becoming part of the forest, part of the endless chorus of the lost. It would be so easy to just close my eyes and let go. But then I heard something else cutting through the whispers, a voice I recognized, but not Jake. It was my daughter Emma, calling my name from somewhere far away. She was looking for me. Worried, sick, probably crying. The thought of her finding my belongings arranged in a neat pile beneath one of these ancient pines snapped me back to awareness. I stumbled to my feet, fighting against the crushing weight of despair that tried to pull me back down. The forest didn't want to let me go. Branches grabbed at my clothes, roots seemed to rise up to trip me, and the whispers turned angry, accusing. They told me I was abandoning Jake, that I was a coward, that I would never be free of the guilt. But I kept moving, following what I hoped was the way out, my phone, its compass spinning wildly but occasionally pointing in what might have been the right direction. The forest fought me every step of the way, but gradually the oppressive weight began to lift. The whispers faded to a dull murmur, then silence. I broke through the tree line as the sun was setting, stumbling onto the main trail where a park ranger was calling my name. I'd been missing for 16 hours, though it felt like days. They found me hypothermic and delusional, babbling about voices in the trees and Jake's ghost. Jake's body was never found, but I know he is still there, trapped in that grove with all the others. Sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind picks up, I swear I can still hear them whispering, calling my name, promising me peace. The whispering pines are still there, waiting. The locals have posted new warning signs, but they won. Matter. People will still find their way there when the weight of living becomes too much to bear. And the forest will welcome them with open arms and whispered promises of an end to pain. I moved away from Washington 6 months ago, but distance doesn't matter. Once the whispering pines get inside your head, they never really let you go. Story 6. Dancing Man. I should have trusted my gut when I saw him dancing under that streetlight at 2 in the morning. The walking trail behind Millfield Community Center was supposed to be my sanctuary. For 3 months after the divorce, I'd been taking midnight walks to clear my head, to escape the empty apartment and the thoughts that kept me awake. The paved path wound through a small patch of woods between subdivisions, lit by old-style street lamps every 100 yards or so. Safe, quiet, predictable. But nothing about the man under the 3rd streetlight was predictable. He was tall and thin, wearing what looked like a formal suit from the 1940s, complete with suspenders and a bow tie. His movements were fluid but wrong somehow, like he was dancing to music only he could hear. His arms swayed in wide arcs while his legs shuffled in complex patterns that belonged in a ballroom, not on a suburban walking trail in the middle of the night. I stopped walking and watched him from about 50 yards away, hidden in the shadow between streetlights. Something about his movements made my skin crawl. They were too precise, too controlled, like a marionette being manipulated by invisible strings. And he never stopped, never paused to rest or adjust his position, just kept dancing in that same hypnotic rhythm, over and over. I should have turned around right then. Should have taken the long way home through the subdivisions. But curiosity got the better of me, and I stepped closer, moving from shadow to shadow along the tree line. That is when I saw his face. Even from 30 yards away, I could see his smile. It was impossibly wide, stretching from ear to ear like someone had carved it into his skull with a knife. His teeth were perfectly straight and white, catching the streetlight like polished bone. But his eyes were completely black, not just dark brown or shadowed, but black like looking into a well at midnight. And he was looking directly at me. The dancing stopped immediately. One moment he was swaying and shuffling in his elaborate routine. The next he was standing perfectly still, his head cocked at an unnatural angle, that grotesque smile never wavering. We stared at each other across the distance, predator and prey sizing each other up in the yellow circle of streetlight. Then he raised one gloved hand and waved at me. Slow, deliberate, like he was greeting an old friend. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I was frozen in place, transfixed by that impossible smile and those bottomless eyes. He took a step toward me, then another, his movements now sharp and jerky like a broken mechanical toy. His legs bent at wrong angles. His arms twitched and spasmed, but somehow he kept moving forward with disturbing efficiency. That broke the spell. I turned and ran back down the trail toward the community center, my footsteps echoing off the pavement like gunshots. Behind me, I could hear him following, but the sounds were all wrong. Not the steady rhythm of running footsteps, but a chaotic percussion of impacts, like he was bouncing off the ground instead of running on it. I risked a glance over my shoulder and immediately wished I hadn't. He was gaining on me, but his method of locomotion defied everything I knew about human movement. His body jerked and spasmed through the air, arms and legs flailing in random directions, but somehow propelling him forward at incredible speed. And through it all, that smile never left his face, even as his head lolled and twisted at impossible angles. I reached the community center parking lot and dove into my car, fumbling with the keys as that thing continued its horrible pursuit. My headlights swept across the trail as I started the engine, and I caught one final glimpse of him standing at the edge of the parking lot, still smiling, still waving, like he was seeing me off on a pleasant evening stroll. I drove home with my doors locked and my hands shaking on the steering wheel. Back in my apartment, I poured myself 3 fingers of bourbon and tried to convince myself it had been some kind of hallucination brought on by stress and insomnia. But over the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen. I started researching the community center, the walking trail, any local history that might explain a man in vintage clothing dancing alone at night. What I found made my blood run cold. The trail had been built over an old section of Millfield Cemetery, the part that had been abandoned in the 1950s when the city expanded. Most of the graves had been moved, but according to municipal records, some had been left behind, paved over and forgotten. The third streetlight, where I first seen the dancing man, sat directly over what had once been a pauper, a section for unclaimed bodies. I found a newspaper article from 1943 about a man named Edmund Fairweather who had been found dead in that exact spot. He'd been a traveling dance instructor, known for his elaborate ballroom performances and his unsettling habit of practicing alone at all hours. The article mentioned his distinctive smile and formal dress, but also hinted at darker rumors. Children in the area had reported seeing him dancing with invisible partners, talking to people who weren't there, behaving in ways that even in the 1940s had been considered deeply disturbing. The article said he died of a heart attack while dancing alone in the cemetery at midnight. But what chilled me most was the final line. Witnesses claimed his body had been found still smiling, still posed in mid-dance step, as if death had caught him in the middle of his favorite routine. Armed with this information, I should have stayed away from the trail permanently. Should have found a new route for my midnight walks, a new way to deal with my insomnia and anxiety. But the rational part of my mind kept insisting that what I'd seen wasn't real. That stress and suggestion had created a vivid hallucination based on subconscious knowledge of the area, its history. So a week later, I went back. This time I brought a camera, determined to either document whatever was happening or prove to myself that I imagined the whole thing. I approached the third streetlight cautiously, staying in the shadows, waiting for any sign of movement. The light cast its yellow circle on empty pavement. No dancing man, no impossible smile, nothing but the normal sounds of a suburban night. I felt simultaneously relieved and disappointed, like part of me had wanted to see him again just to confirm I wasn't losing my mind. I was about to leave when I heard the music. It was faint at first, like it was coming from a great distance or through thick walls. Big band music from the 1940s, the kind of swing jazz that Edmund Fairweather would have danced to during his lifetime. But there was something wrong with it, like it was being played at the wrong speed or through damaged speakers. The music grew louder, and I saw him materialize under the streetlight like he was stepping out of the air itself. One moment the space was empty, the next Edmund Fairweather was there in his formal suit and bow tie, moving to the rhythm of ghostly music with that terrible smile splitting his face from ear to ear. But this time he wasn't alone. Transparent figures danced around him, dozens of them, all in period clothing from different eras. A woman in a 1920s flapper dress spun endlessly in place. A man in Civil War uniform waltzed with empty air. Children in Victorian clothing skipped in complex patterns around the adult dancers. They were all smiling. All of them had that same impossibly wide grin that revealed too many teeth, eyes that reflected no light, movements that belonged more to marionettes than human beings. And they were all looking at me. The ghostly orchestra of dancers began moving toward my hiding spot, their feet making no sound on the pavement, but their presence growing more oppressive with each step. Edmund Fairweather led them, his jerky, spasmodic movements now revealed as some kind of supernatural choreography that the others followed in perfect synchronization. I raised my camera and started filming, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the device steady. The footage would be proof, evidence that would validate everything I experienced. But as soon as the camera focused on the dancers, they stopped moving. Every single figure froze in place, their heads turning toward me with mechanical precision. Edmund's smile grew even wider, if such a thing was possible, and he pointed one gloved finger directly at the camera lens. The device went dead in my hands, the screen flickering to black despite a full battery. In the sudden silence, I could hear my own ragged breathing and the thundering of my heartbeat. Then Edmund clapped his hands once, a sound like a gunshot in the quiet night. The entire troop of ghostly dancers began moving toward me again, but now their movements were faster, more aggressive. They jerked and twitched across the pavement like broken toys wound too tight, their smiles never wavering even as their bodies contorted in impossible ways. I ran again, crashing through the underbrush beside the trail rather than staying on the open pavement. Behind me, I could hear them following, but the sounds were even more disturbing than before. Not footsteps, but a cacophony of impacts, like dozens of bodies hitting the ground in random patterns, overlaid with the faint sound of that ghostly big band music. I burst out of the woods onto Maple Street and kept running until I reached my apartment building. Behind me, the sounds of pursuit faded into the normal nighttime ambiance of suburban Millfield. But when I finally stopped and looked back, I could see them standing at the edge of the woods, a crowd of impossible figures silhouetted against the darkness, all of them waving goodbye with that same slow, deliberate gesture Edmund had used during our first encounter. The camera never worked again, despite being less than a year old and showing no signs of physical damage. The footage I tried to record was gone, leaving no evidence beyond my own testimony and the growing certainty that I stumbled onto something far more dangerous than a simple ghost story. I stopped taking midnight walks after that, started dealing with my insomnia through medication and therapy instead of solitary exercise. But even now, months later, I sometimes hear big band music drifting through my apartment windows on quiet nights. And sometimes, when I am driving past the community center during the day, I catch glimpses of figures moving between the trees along the walking trail. Always dancing, always smiling, always waiting for the next lonely soul who might wander into their eternal performance. The city council received several complaints about the trail lighting after my encounters. Other late-night walkers had reported seeing strange figures, hearing unexplained music, feeling watched by invisible eyes. But instead of investigating, they simply installed brighter streetlights and posted signs warning people to avoid the trail after sunset. They thought better lighting would solve the problem. But I know the truth. Some dances never end, and some performers never leave the stage, no matter how bright you make the lights or how many warning signs you post. Edmund Fairweather found his perfect venue in that abandoned cemetery, and death was just an intermission in a show that has been running for over 80 years. The only question is whether you be in the audience or become part of the cast when the next performance begins. Story 7. Last resident. The real estate listing for Harlow, Texas didn't mention the bodies buried in the community garden. I found the first one while installing fiber optic cables behind the old general store. My shovel hit something that definitely wasn't a root, and when I brushed away the dirt, a human skull grinned up at me through the black Texas soil. The bone was old but not ancient, maybe 10 or 15 years weathered. Fresh enough to still smell like death when the wind shifted. I was part of the advance team for Sunbelt Development, tasked with bringing high-speed internet and modern amenities to forgotten towns across rural Texas. Harlow was supposed to be our easiest project yet. Population 0 according to the 2020 census. No residents to relocate, no infrastructure to work around. Just a clean slate of abandoned buildings waiting to be transformed into a boutique destination for Austin millennials looking for authentic small-town charm. But Harlow wasn't as empty as our surveys indicated. The town sat in a valley about 90 miles southeast of Austin, surrounded by scrub brush and mesquite trees that had reclaimed most of the residential streets. Main Street still held the bones of commerce, a bank, a diner, a hardware store, all with their windows boarded up and their signs faded to illegibility. At the far end of town, perched on a small hill like a Gothic cathedral, stood the old Harlow home for children. The orphanage had been closed since the 1970s. Its red brick walls now crumbling and covered in ivy. Our team had been working in Harlow for 3 weeks when things started going wrong. First, it was small stuff. Tools going missing overnight, equipment moved to different locations, fresh tire tracks in the dirt where no vehicles should have been. We blamed vandals or curious locals from neighboring towns. Then Marcus disappeared. He was our heavy equipment operator, a big guy from Houston who could handle a backhoe like it was a toy. I worked with Marcus on a dozen projects over the past 5 years. He wasn't the type to just walk off the job, especially not in the middle of nowhere with no transportation. We found his excavator parked behind the old church, engine still running, the cab door hanging open. His lunch was still sitting on the dashboard, barely touched. But Marcus was gone, like he simply vanished mid-bite. The sheriff from the county seat came out to take a report, but he didn't seem too concerned. Said men like Marcus had a tendency to disappear when child support caught up with them. Said the Texas desert was full of guys who decided to start over somewhere new. But I knew better. Marcus had been talking about his daughter, his upcoming birthday all week. He had her picture taped to his toolbox. Whatever happened to him, he didn't leave voluntarily. That night, I decided to stay behind after the rest of the crew returned to our motel in the next town over. I wanted to poke around, see if I could find any clues about where Marcus had gone. The sun was setting, painting the abandoned buildings in shades of orange and red that made them look like they were still burning from whatever fire had driven out the last residents decades ago. I started with the church where we found the excavator. The building was in better shape than most, its white clapboard siding only partially rotted. The front door was padlocked, but the chain was loose enough that I could squeeze through. Inside, dust motes danced in the evening light filtering through broken stained glass windows. The pews were still arranged in perfect rows, as if the congregation had just stepped out for a moment and would be back any minute. But it was what I found in the basement that made my blood run cold. The church basement had been converted into some kind of workshop. Workbenches lined the walls, covered with tools that looked both ancient and recently used. Handsaws with teeth sharp enough to cut bone, hammers with heads stained dark brown, chisels arranged in neat rows like surgical instruments, and hanging from hooks on the far wall were what looked like pieces of clothing. But as my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I realized they weren't clothes at all. They were strips of leather, carefully tanned and worked, sewn together with thick black thread. Human leather. I was backing toward the stairs when I heard it, a sound like heavy breathing, coming from somewhere deeper in the basement. But not just breathing, whispered words, so low and guttural I couldn't make them out. They seemed to be coming from behind a wooden door I hadn't noticed before, partially hidden behind one of the workbenches. Every instinct told me to run, to get out of that basement and out of Harlow and never come back. But I thought about Marcus, about his daughter, this picture, about the possibility that he might still be alive somewhere in this nightmare town. I approached the door with shaking hands and pressed my ear against the wood. The whispering stopped immediately, like whatever was behind the door knew I was there. In the sudden silence, I could hear my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. Then something hit the door from the other side with tremendous force, shaking the entire frame. I stumbled backward as the sound echoed through the basement like a gunshot. Whatever was behind that door was big, powerful, and very much aware of my presence. I ran then, taking the basement stairs 3 at a time and bursting out of the church into the fading daylight. But as I reached my truck, I made the mistake of looking back at the orphanage on the hill. A figure stood in one of the upper windows, silhouetted against the dying light. Massive and motionless, wearing what looked like a burlap sack over its head with holes cut out for eyes. It watched me with the patience of something that had been waiting for decades and could wait decades more. I drove back to the motel that night, but I didn't sleep. Instead, I spent hours researching the history of Harlow, digging through old newspaper archives and county records. What I found made the pieces start falling into place. Harlow had been a thriving community until the late 1960s, sustained by cattle ranching and the state-funded orphanage. But in 1969, there had been a scandal, allegations of abuse at the home for children, whispers of missing children, investigations that never quite led to charges. The orphanage was quietly shuttered in 1971, and within a few years, most of the town This residence had moved on to greener pastures. But according to the records, one resident had never left. The orphanage, its groundskeeper, a man named Samuel Pruitt, had been born at the home in 1943 and had never known any other life. When the orphanage closed, he simply stayed, becoming the town's sole remaining inhabitant. That had been over 50 years ago. If Samuel Pruitt was still alive, he'd be pushing 80. But the figure I'd seen in the window had moved with the strength and purpose of someone much younger. The next morning, I convinced the rest of my crew to pack up and leave. Told them the soil conditions were wrong for our equipment, that we needed to reassess the project. They grumbled about the wasted time, but they loaded up their trucks and headed back to Austin. I should have gone with them. Should have filed my report and recommended that Sunbelt find a different town to gentrify. But something about those whispered words in the church basement haunted me. They sounded almost like a plea, like someone crying for help. I drove back to Harlow alone that evening, armed with a flashlight and a crowbar I bought at a hardware store along the way. This time, I went straight to the orphanage. The building was even more imposing up close, its red brick walls rising 3 stories into the darkening sky. Most of the windows were boarded up, but a few on the upper floor still held their glass, reflecting the last rays of sunlight like watching eyes. The front door was secured with a modern padlock, the kind that would take serious tools to break. But around back, I found a cellar entrance where the wooden doors had rotted away completely. The opening led down into absolute darkness, and the smell that rose from it made my stomach turn. Sweet and sick, like flowers left too long in stagnant water. I clicked on my flashlight and descended into the cellar, trying to breathe through my mouth to avoid the worst of the stench. The basement was larger than I'd expected, with stone walls that wept moisture and a floor covered in what looked like sawdust. But as my light played across the scattered material, I realized it wasn't sawdust at all. It was bone meal, ground human bones, spread across the floor like fertilizer. That's when I heard the footsteps above me, slow and deliberate, like someone moving through the orphanage with intimate knowledge of every creaking floorboard. The sounds were coming from the first floor, directly overhead. I found a staircase leading up from the cellar and climbed it carefully, my flashlight beam dancing ahead of me into the darkness. The first floor was a maze of hallways and small rooms that had once housed dozens of children. The wallpaper was peeling in long strips, and the floorboards were soft with rot. But someone had been maintaining the building. Oil lanterns hung from hooks on the walls, and the dust had been swept into neat piles in the corners. The footsteps had stopped, but I could sense a presence nearby. Something watching me from the shadows, evaluating me, deciding what to do with this latest intruder in its domain. I followed the main hallway toward what had once been the administrative offices, my flashlight beam revealing glimpses of a building frozen in time. Children, this drawing still hung on some walls, faded with age but depicting the same themes over and over. Families, houses with white picket fences, dreams of adoption and love. But mixed in with the innocent artwork were newer additions, photographs pinned to the walls with rusted thumbtacks, pictures of the development crew working around town, taken with a telephoto lens from hidden vantage points, pictures of Marcus operating his excavator, pictures of me installing fiber optic cables. Someone had been watching us since we arrived in Harlow, documenting our presence, learning our routines, planning something terrible. I found Marcus in what had once been the orphanage dining hall. He was alive, but barely, chained to a support beam in the center of the room, his clothes torn and stained with blood and worse things. His eyes were open, but they didn't track my movement when I stepped into the room. Whatever had been done to him had broken something fundamental in his mind. Around him, arranged in a perfect circle, were the bones of previous visitors. Dozens of skeletons, picked clean and arranged with obsessive care. Some were old, yellowed with age. Others were fresher, still showing traces of dried flesh and gristle. But Marcus wasn't alone in the dining hall. Samuel Pruitt sat at the head table where the orphanage director had once taken his meals. He was enormous, easily 6.5 feet tall, with the kind of bulk that comes from decades of physical labor. His face was hidden behind a mask made of burlap and human hair, stitched together with the same black thread I'd seen in the church basement. He didn't move when I entered the room, just watched me with eyes that reflected my flashlight beam like an animal. In his massive hands, he held a woodworking tool, something like a draw knife but larger, designed for shaping and carving. When he finally spoke, his voice was the same whispered sound I heard in the church basement. Rough and unused, like someone who spent decades talking only to himself. He told me about the children who lived in the home, about the loneliness of being the one nobody wanted to adopt, about watching other kids leave for new families while he stayed behind, tending the grounds, invisible to everyone who mattered. He told me about the years after the orphanage closed, when he waited for someone to come back. Anyone, the state workers who had forgotten he existed, the social services people who never checked on the last child who never found a home. But no one ever came. No one except developers and investors and people who saw Harlow as nothing more than a blank space to be filled with their own dreams. He told me about Marcus, about the others who had come before. How he tried to make them understand that Harlow wasn't empty, that it had always been his home, that some things shouldn't be bought and sold and torn down for progress. But they never listened, so he made them part of the community instead. Made them permanent residents who would never leave, never forget, never try to change what had been his sanctuary for 50 years. As he spoke, he stood up from the table, his massive frame unfolding like a mountain coming to life. The tool in his hands caught the light, its edge honed to razor sharpness. He explained that I could join Marcus and the others, become part of Harlow's eternal population. Or I could leave and never come back, never speak of what I found, never let anyone disturb his peace again. But even as he offered me the choice, I could see the hunger in his eyes. The desperate need for company after decades of isolation. He didn't want me to leave. He wanted me to stay, to become another permanent resident in his town of bones. I ran then, crashing through the orphanage hallways toward the cellar stairs. Behind me, I could hear Samuel Pruitt following, his footsteps shaking the building with each step. He wasn't hurrying, didn't he too? He knew every hiding place in Harlow, every route of escape. I made it to my truck and gunned the engine, spraying gravel as I tore out of the orphanage driveway. In my rearview mirror, I could see him standing in the doorway, watching me flee with the patience of someone who knew I'd eventually have to come back. Because I left Marcus behind, left him chained in that dining hall with the bones of all the others who made the mistake of trying to change Harlow. I drove straight to the sheriff's office, but my report was met with skepticism and suggestions that I seek professional help for stress and sleep deprivation. When I finally convinced them to send a car to check on the orphanage, they found nothing. No chains, no bones, no sign that anyone had been in the building for decades. But they also found no sign of Marcus. Sunbelt Development canceled the Harlow project after my report, citing unstable soil conditions and potential environmental hazards. The town was left alone, forgotten once again by a world that had moved on to easier profits. But I know Samuel Pruitt is still there, waiting in his orphanage on the hill. Still hoping for visitors who might decide to stay permanently. Still protecting his home from anyone who would dare to change it. Sometimes I dream about Marcus, chained in that dining hall, slowly becoming part of Samuel's eternal community. Sometimes I wonder how many other development projects have stumbled across towns like Harlow, places where the last residents refused to be bought out or moved on. And sometimes, late at night when the Texas wind is howling through my apartment in Austin, I can swear I hear Samuel Pruitt whispering my name, inviting me to come home to the only family he has ever known. Story 8. White SUVs. The first white SUV appeared in my rearview mirror exactly 3 minutes after I crossed the Colorado City town limits. I know because I was checking my phone for the time when those headlights materialized out of the desert darkness, matching my speed with mechanical precision. I should have turned around right then. Should have listened to the voice in my head screaming that this place felt wrong from the moment I saw the first compound-style house with its high walls and multiple mailboxes. But my fuel gauge was sitting on empty, and the next town was 40 miles of nothing through Arizona wasteland. The SUV stayed exactly 4 car lengths behind me as I drove down what passed for Main Street. No streetlights, no neon signs advertising motels or restaurants. Just identical houses set back from the road, each one looking like a fortress designed to keep the world out. Or to keep something in. My name is David Chen, and I am a freelance journalist. Was a freelance journalist after what happened in Colorado City. I'm not sure I can call myself that anymore. Some stories cost more than you're willing to pay, and some places leave marks on your soul that never fade. I've been driving from Phoenix to Denver, chasing a lead about water rights disputes in rural communities. Nothing sinister, nothing that should have put me in danger. Just a routine assignment that paid decent money and let me see parts of the country most people never visit. The GPS had routed me through Colorado City as a shortcut, showing it would save me nearly an hour compared to staying on the main highways. What it didn't to show was the feeling of invisible eyes tracking every movement, or the way normal sound seemed muffled here, as if the desert itself was holding its breath. The gas station sat on the edge of town like an afterthought. Single island, ancient pumps, and a small building that looked like it had been painted white about 30 years ago and never touched since. The white SUV pulled into the lot behind me, parking close enough that I could see the outline of at least two people inside. They didn't get out. They just sat there, watching. I tried to ignore them as I filled my tank, but every instinct I developed in 15 years of investigative reporting was screaming warnings. The air smelled wrong here. Too dry, too still, with an underlying scent like old incense mixed with something metallic. Fear, maybe, or blood. The station attendant emerged from the building as I finished pumping. He was young, maybe 19, with the kind of pale complexion that comes from spending too much time indoors. His clothes were plain but clean. Dark pants, white shirt, no logos or decoration. He moved with the careful precision of someone who had been taught that every action had consequences. When he looked at me, his eyes held a desperate kind of fear that made my stomach clench. Like a drowning man who spotted a life preserver but was too afraid to reach for it. I paid cash, hoping to avoid unnecessary conversation, but he lingered after making my change. His lips moved silently, as if he was rehearsing words he couldn't quite bring himself to say aloud. Finally, he managed a single whispered sentence that changed everything. He told me to leave town immediately. Not in an hour, not after grabbing dinner, now. But when I asked why, he just shook his head and glanced nervously toward the white SUV. The fear in his eyes deepened, and I realized he wasn't just afraid of me staying. He was afraid of being seen talking to me at all. I drove away with more questions than answers, but I didn't leave town. Journalistic curiosity had kept me alive in war zones and disaster areas, and it wasn't about to let me walk away from whatever was happening in Colorado City. Instead, I found a small hill overlooking the community and parked where I could observe without being easily spotted. What I saw through my telephoto lens defied easy explanation. The white SUVs were everywhere. Not just the one that had followed me, but dozens of them, moving through the streets in coordinated patterns like some kind of mechanized patrol system. They stopped at certain houses, and men would emerge to have brief conversations with the drivers. Always men. I never saw a single woman outside after dark, and the few children I glimpsed were quickly ushered indoors the moment they appeared. The houses themselves were architectural puzzles. Many appeared to have been expanded repeatedly, with additions built onto additions until they resembled small apartment complexes more than family homes. Multiple entrances, multiple driveways, enough space for extended families or something more complicated. Around midnight, I witnessed something that made my blood run cold. A young man, maybe 25, was escorted from one of the larger houses by four men in identical dark clothing. He wasn't fighting them, but his body language screamed reluctance and fear. They put him in the back of a white SUV and drove toward the edge of town, toward the desert where the roads disappeared into endless darkness. I followed at a distance, lights off, using the moonlight to navigate the rough terrain. The SUV stopped at what looked like a crossroads in the middle of nowhere. The young man was removed from the vehicle, given a small bag that might have contained supplies, and pointed toward a dirt track leading east. Then they drove away and left him there, alone, in the desert, at night. I wanted to help him, but something held me back. A primal understanding that interfering would bring consequences I wasn't prepared to face. Instead, I watched through my camera, this night vision as he started walking east, disappearing into the vastness like he never existed at all. When I tried to research Colorado City later that night, what I found made everything worse. The town was controlled by the fundamentalist Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, a polygamist sect that had been accused of horrific practices for decades. Child marriage, human trafficking, something they called blood atonement, for those who crossed the leadership. And most relevant to what I witnessed, the systematic expulsion of young men who might compete with older leaders for wives. They called it the purge. Young men would be accused of minor infractions, excommunicated from the church, and literally driven into the desert with minimal supplies. Most were never seen again. Those who survived rarely spoke about their experiences, and when they did, their accounts were dismissed as the bitter fantasies of outcasts seeking revenge. But I had photos, video footage of the exile I witnessed. Evidence that these purges were still happening, decades after they were supposed to have been stopped by federal intervention. I should have left Colorado City that night and never returned. Should have published my story and let the authorities handle whatever investigation might follow. Instead, I decided to stay another day, to dig deeper, to get the kind of evidence that would make prosecution inevitable. That decision nearly cost me everything. I spent the next morning photographing the compound-style houses and documenting the movement patterns of the white SUVs. By afternoon, I established that there were at least 12 vehicles involved in the patrol system, all identical, all driven by men who looked like they'd been selected for physical intimidation rather than driving skill. The breakthrough came when I managed to get close enough to one of the houses to use my directional microphone. What I heard through those walls would haunt me for the rest of my life. Children crying. Not the normal sounds of childhood upset, but the kind of desperate sobbing that comes from genuine terror. Women, whose voices, too many of them in one space, speaking in hushed tones about someone called the Prophet, and what would happen if they failed to please him. And underneath it all, the sound of construction. Hammering, sawing, the scrape of heavy objects being moved, as if they were building something inside that house, or modifying it, creating spaces that weren't meant to be found. I was so focused on recording that I almost missed the white SUV pulling up behind my position. Almost, the driver got out slowly, deliberately, giving me time to see the size of him. 6.5 feet tall, built like a linebacker, wearing the same plain clothes I'd seen on all the other enforcers. He approached my car with the casual confidence of someone who'd done this many times before. When he tapped on my window, I had no choice but to roll it down. His voice was soft, polite, completely at odds with the physical menace he projected. He asked what I was doing in Colorado City. I gave him the standard cover story. Lost tourist, looking for a place to eat, fascinated by the unique architecture. He listened without expression, nodding at appropriate moments, but his eyes never left mine. When I finished, he smiled, and that smile was worse than any threat he could have made. He told me there were no restaurants in Colorado City. No hotels, no services for outsiders. He suggested I continue my journey to the next town, where I would find everything I needed. The conversation was perfectly polite, perfectly reasonable, and absolutely terrifying. Because beneath his calm words was an unmistakable message: leave now, or face consequences that would make exile in the desert seem merciful. I agreed immediately, started my car, and began driving toward the town limits. But in my rearview mirror, I could see him making a phone call, and within minutes, white SUVs were emerging from side streets like antibodies responding to an infection. They formed a convoy behind me, not following aggressively, not trying to run me off the road, just maintaining a steady presence that made it clear I was being escorted whether I liked it or not. 6 vehicles, 12 men minimum, all focused on making sure I left their territory and never came back. But I made copies of everything. Photos, video footage, audio recordings. Evidence of a community living outside the reach of federal law, where children disappeared and young men were abandoned in the desert. I had what I needed to bring this story to light, or so I thought. When I reached the next town and stopped at a diner to review my materials, every file was corrupted. Not deleted, corrupted. The photos showed nothing but digital static. The videos were unwatchable messes of pixels and distortion. The audio recordings contained only white noise. My camera had been functioning perfectly when I left Colorado City. The files had been intact when I reviewed them during the drive. But somewhere between the town limits and the diner, everything had been destroyed from the inside out, as if the equipment itself had decided to forget what it had witnessed. I tried to reconstruct the story from memory, typing frantically on my laptop while the details were still fresh. But every time I mentioned Colorado City by name, the document would crash. Every time I tried to describe the white SUVs or the house modifications or the sounds I heard, the words would disappear from the screen as fast as I could type them. It took me 3 days to realize what was happening. The corruption wasn't random equipment failure or coincidental computer problems. It was deliberate, systematic. Someone with serious technical resources was making sure that certain information could never be preserved or transmitted. I tried different computers, different software, different networks. The result was always the same. Any attempt to document what I'd seen in Colorado City would be met with immediate digital sabotage. My story was being erased in real time by people who had the power to reach into any system and destroy evidence before it could be shared. But they couldn't to erase my memory. Not yet. I drove home to Phoenix in a state of paranoid exhaustion, checking my mirrors constantly for white SUVs that never appeared. My apartment felt like a sanctuary until I found the business card that had been slipped under my door while I was gone. Plain white cardstock with a phone number in black ink. Nothing else. No name, no company, no logo. But I knew who had left it, and I knew what would happen if I called that number. I threw the card away and tried to resume my normal life. I had other assignments, other stories that needed to be told. But Colorado City haunted every quiet moment. The memory of that young man walking into the desert, the sounds of children crying behind compound walls, the systematic erasure of evidence by people with resources I couldn't to even imagine. 3 weeks later, I found another card. This time it was tucked into my mailbox, placed carefully so I would see it immediately when I checked for letters. Same design, same phone number, but this one had a handwritten message on the back. Some stories are better left untold. I called my editor and tried to explain what had happened, but the words wouldn't come. Every time I mentioned Colorado City, I would forget what I was trying to say. Not the memory of being there, but the ability to communicate that memory to others. As if my brain had been programmed to protect certain information from being shared. That's when I realized the true horror of what I encountered. They weren't just covering up their crimes. They were making it impossible for witnesses to report those crimes. Some combination of technology and psychology that could reach into a person's mind and sever the connection between memory and communication. I am telling this story now because I may not be able to tell it much longer. The cards keep appearing, under my door, in my mailbox, tucked under my windshield wipers. And each time, I can feel my ability to recall details slipping away like sand through my fingers. The white SUVs patrol more than just the streets of Colorado City. They patrol the boundaries of what can be known and what must remain hidden. They are the enforcement arm of secrets so dangerous that even acknowledging their existence requires specialized countermeasures. If you ever find yourself driving through southern Utah or northern Arizona, and you see road signs pointing toward Colorado City, keep driving. Don, to stop for gas. Don, to take photos. Don, to ask questions. And if you see a white SUV in your rearview mirror, maintaining perfect distance and matching your every move, do not try to lose it. Do not try to confront it. Just drive to the next major city and hope they decide you were not worth the effort it would take to silence you permanently. Some places exist in the shadows between law and chaos, where powerful men make their own rules and enforce them with methods that would be impossible anywhere else. Colorado City is one of those places, a pocket of darkness in the American desert where terrible things happen and the evidence disappears before it can reach the outside world. I have maybe a week before I lose the ability to remember this story clearly enough to tell it. Maybe less. The cards are coming more frequently now, and each one carries the same message in different words. Forget what you saw. Forget what you know. Forget that Colorado City exists at all. But I am fighting that forgetting with everything I have left. Because somewhere in that compound community, children are crying behind walls built to muffle their voices. Young men are being driven into the desert to die. And a system of control so complete and so sophisticated continues to operate with impunity, protected by technology that can reach into human minds and delete inconvenient truths. This is my testimony, my confession, my warning to anyone who might be tempted to investigate what lies behind those white SUVs and compound walls. Do not go to Colorado City. Do not seek the truth about what happens there. Some knowledge is too dangerous to possess, and some stories demand a price that few are willing to pay. Story 9. The wine glass exploded in my hand before I even touched it, and the blood mixed with the red wine on Ashley's tavern floor like it belonged there. My name is Mark Stevens, and I am a restaurant equipment inspector for the Florida Department of Health. I have been inside every type of food establishment you can imagine, from 5-star hotels to roadside diners that should have been condemned decades ago. But what happened to me at Ashley's Tavern in Rockledge changed everything I thought I knew about the restaurant business. The call came in on a Tuesday morning in October. A complaint had been filed about strange incidents at Ashley's Tavern that were allegedly affecting food safety and patron welfare. The complaint was vague, mentioning broken glassware, unexplained accidents, and staff refusing to work certain shifts. It sounded like a typical workplace safety issue, probably some disgruntled employees trying to cause trouble for management. Ashley's Tavern sits on Highway 1 in Rockledge, a small city between Orlando and the Kennedy Space Center. The building dates back to the 1920s, when it served as a private residence before being converted into a restaurant sometime in the 60s. From the outside, it looks like any other historic Florida establishment, with weathered wood siding and a broad front porch overlooking the Indian River. I arrived at 3 in the afternoon, during the quiet hours between lunch and dinner service. The parking lot was nearly empty except for a few staff cars and a delivery truck. The manager who met me at the front door was a nervous woman in her 40s named Carol, and she seemed relieved that someone from the state had finally come to investigate. Carol led me through the main dining room, pointing out recent damage that had occurred without explanation. Tables and chairs had been moved overnight despite the building being locked and secured. Glassware had shattered spontaneously during business hours, sometimes injuring customers and staff. Wine bottles had fallen from shelves that were perfectly level and properly secured. But it was the staircase to the second-floor dining area that really caught my attention. The wooden steps were old but solid, with a polished handrail that showed decades of use. But according to Carol, at least 6 customers in the past month had fallen down these stairs under mysterious circumstances. Not simple trips or stumbles, but violent falls as if they had been pushed from behind by an unseen force. 2 of the incidents had resulted in broken bones and emergency room visits. The restaurant's insurance company was threatening to drop their coverage if the problem was not resolved immediately. Carol told me that several longtime employees had quit in recent weeks, claiming they felt unwelcome in certain parts of the building. The women's bathroom on the first floor was particularly problematic. Female staff members and customers reported seeing a woman in outdated clothing standing by the mirror, but when they turned to look directly, no one was there. I asked Carol about the history of the building, thinking that previous renovations or structural issues might explain the accidents and strange occurrences. That was when she told me about Ethel Allen. In 1934, this building had been a boarding house run by a woman named Ethel Allen. She was known throughout Rockledge as a strict but fair landlady who rented rooms to traveling salesmen and seasonal workers. But on November 15th of that year, Ethel was found murdered in what is now the women's bathroom, beaten to death with a blunt object that was never recovered. The case had never been solved. Police suspected one of her boarders, a drifter who had disappeared the same night Ethel was killed, but no arrest was ever made. Ethel was buried in the local cemetery, and the boarding house changed hands several times before being converted into Ashley's Tavern. Carol mentioned that previous owners and managers had experienced similar problems over the decades. Unexplained accidents, equipment malfunctions, and sightings of a woman who did not belong in the building. But the current incidents were more frequent and more violent than anything reported before. I began my inspection in the kitchen, checking equipment and food storage areas for standard health code violations. Everything appeared normal until I opened the walk-in cooler. The temperature was correct, and the food was properly stored, but something felt wrong about the space. The air seemed thicker, colder than it should have been even for a refrigerated room. As I examined the shelving units, I noticed scratch marks in the metal walls that looked deliberate, almost like someone had been clawing at the surface from the inside. When I asked the kitchen staff about the marks, they exchanged nervous glances and claimed they had never noticed them before. The dishwashing area showed signs of repeated flooding, despite the plumbing being in good condition. The floor drains were clear, and the water pressure was adequate, but according to the staff, the sinks overflowed almost daily for no apparent reason. They had called plumbers multiple times, but no mechanical problem could be identified. I moved on to the dining areas, testing the stability of tables and chairs, checking the condition of the floors and walls. The first floor seemed normal enough, though I noticed that the temperature varied significantly from room to room despite a central air conditioning system that appeared to be functioning properly. It was when I climbed the staircase to the second floor that things began to go wrong. The first step felt solid under my foot, but as I reached the midpoint of the stairs, I felt a distinct pressure against my back, as if someone was standing directly behind me. I turned around, but the staircase was empty. Carol was still downstairs, talking to one of the servers, and I could hear her voice clearly from where I stood. I continued up the stairs, but the pressure against my back intensified with each step. By the time I reached the top, I felt like invisible hands were pushing me forward, trying to make me lose my balance and fall back down the wooden steps. The second-floor dining room was set up for a private party that evening, with round tables covered in white tablecloths and formal place settings. As I walked between the tables, checking the stability of the floor and the condition of the ceiling, I heard something that made me stop dead in my tracks. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps coming from directly above me. But according to Carol, there was no third floor, just an attic space that was used for storage and accessed only by a pull-down ladder in the kitchen. The footsteps moved from one end of the ceiling to the other, then back again, as if someone was pacing back and forth in the attic. I called down to Carol, asking if anyone was supposed to be working upstairs, but she assured me that all staff members were accounted for on the first floor. I decided to investigate the attic space. Back in the kitchen, I located the access ladder and climbed up into the storage area. My flashlight revealed boxes of old restaurant supplies, broken furniture, and decades of accumulated dust. But there was something else. In the dust on the floor, I could see fresh footprints. Adult-sized shoe prints that led from the access opening to a far corner of the attic, then disappeared entirely. The prints were too large to belong to Carol or any of the female staff members I had seen, and too recent to have been made during previous inspections or maintenance work. I followed the footprints to the corner where they ended, and that was when I found the photographs. Hidden behind a stack of old boxes was a collection of black and white photographs from the 1930s. They showed the building when it was still a boarding house, with images of Ethel Allen and several of her tenants. Most of the photos were typical posed shots, the kind people took for family albums or local newspapers. But the last photograph in the stack made my blood run cold. It showed Ethel Allen standing in what was now the women's bathroom, but she was not alone. Behind her, barely visible in the shadows, was the figure of a man. He was holding something in his right hand, something that looked like a heavy piece of metal or wood. The expression on his face was pure rage. This photograph had been taken moments before Ethel Allen was murdered. I took the photo down to Carol and asked if she had ever seen it before. Her face went pale as she examined the image, and she told me that several previous managers had found similar photographs hidden throughout the building over the years. Each time, they had turned the photos over to the police, but the case remained unsolved. Carol mentioned something else that made the situation even more disturbing. The man in the photograph looked exactly like someone who had been coming to the restaurant regularly for the past several months. A middle-aged customer who always sat alone, never ordered much food, and made other patrons uncomfortable with his intense staring. This regular customer had been in the restaurant the night before each of the recent staircase accidents. He had been present when the glassware started shattering spontaneously. And, according to female staff members, he had been seen near the women's bathroom during several of the reported sightings of Ethel Allen's apparition. But here was the truly terrifying part. When Carol had tried to get more information about this customer, she discovered that he paid only in cash, never used a credit card, and claimed his name was different each time staff members asked. Security cameras had captured him entering and leaving the restaurant, but the footage always showed him from behind or at angles that made his face impossible to identify clearly. It was as if he knew exactly where the cameras were positioned and how to avoid them. I was studying the photograph more closely when the lights went out. The restaurant was plunged into complete darkness, and the emergency lighting system failed to activate. I could hear Carol calling for the maintenance staff to check the electrical panel, but her voice sounded distant and distorted, as if it were coming from much farther away than it should have been. In the darkness, I heard the sound of breaking glass coming from multiple directions. Not just one or two pieces, but dozens of glasses and bottles shattering simultaneously throughout the building. The sound went on for nearly a minute, a continuous symphony of destruction that seemed to come from every room at once. When the lights came back on, the scene was devastating. Every piece of glassware in the main dining room had exploded. Wine glasses, beer mugs, water glasses, and bottles behind the bar had shattered, covering the floors and tables with glittering fragments. But the breakage was not random. The shattered glass formed patterns on the floor, spelling out words in jagged letters. "Get out. Leave her alone. Never again." Carol stood frozen in the doorway, staring at the destruction. She told me that this was the worst incident they had ever experienced, far beyond anything that had happened during previous supernatural events. It was as if something had been building up pressure for weeks and had finally exploded into violent action. But the most disturbing part was still to come. As we surveyed the damage, I noticed that the photograph of Ethel Allen and her killer was no longer in my hand. I had been holding it when the lights went out, but now it was gone. We searched through the broken glass and overturned furniture, but the image had disappeared completely. That was when Carol grabbed my arm and pointed toward the women's bathroom. Standing in the doorway was a woman in a 1930s dress, her hair styled in finger waves that had been popular during that era. She was transparent, like a reflection in water, but her expression was clearly visible. She looked terrified, and she was pointing at something behind us. I turned around to see what had frightened her, and that was when I saw him. The man from the photograph was standing at the foot of the staircase, solid and real, not a ghost or apparition. He was holding the same heavy object I had seen in the vintage image, and his face showed the same expression of murderous rage that had been captured nearly 90 years ago. But this was impossible. The man in the photograph should have been dead for decades. Even if he had been young in 1934, he would be well over 100 years old by now. Yet here he stood, looking exactly as he had in the old black and white image. Carol was backing toward the rear exit, but I found myself unable to move. The man began walking toward us, and with each step he took, the temperature in the room dropped noticeably. My breath began to fog in the suddenly frigid air, and frost started forming on the remaining unbroken surfaces. That was when I understood the truth. This was not a haunting in the traditional sense. Ethel Allen's spirit was not trying to harm anyone. She was trying to warn us. For nearly 90 years, she had been trapped in this building with her killer, watching him return night after night to relive the moment of her murder. The recent escalation of supernatural activity was not random. It was Ethel's desperate attempt to get someone's attention, to finally expose the man who had taken her life and somehow cheated death to continue tormenting her. The man from 1934 had found a way to exist between life and death, feeding off the fear and violence he created in the restaurant that now occupied his victim's final resting place. Each accident, each terrified customer, each broken glass gave him more power to maintain his unnatural existence. I realized that my inspection had triggered something, that finding the photograph had somehow disrupted the delicate balance that had allowed him to hide for so long. Ethel was no longer content to be a passive victim. She was fighting back. The temperature continued to drop as the man approached. Ice crystals began forming on the walls, and my flashlight beam started to dim as the batteries drained in the supernatural cold. But just as he raised the heavy object in his hand, preparing to strike, something extraordinary happened. Ethel Allen stepped between us. Her translucent form became more solid, more real, drawing energy from somewhere deep within the building's foundation. She faced her killer with a courage that transcended death, and for the first time in 90 years, he stopped advancing. The confrontation lasted only seconds, but it felt like hours. Two forces that had been locked in supernatural conflict for nearly a century finally faced each other directly, with living witnesses present to see the resolution. When it was over, both figures simply faded away. The man from the photograph dissolved like smoke, his expression changing from rage to surprise to something that might have been relief. Ethel Allen turned to look at Carol and me one final time, and I swear she smiled before disappearing into whatever realm awaits those who finally find justice. The temperature returned to normal immediately, and the oppressive atmosphere that had hung over the restaurant lifted like fog burning off in morning sunlight. I completed my inspection report, documenting the structural and equipment issues I had found but making no mention of the supernatural events. Officially, Ashley's Tavern passed its health department review with only minor recommendations for improved ventilation in the kitchen. But I included something else in my confidential notes. I recommended that the restaurant display information about Ethel Allen and the building's history, acknowledging her tragic death and honoring her memory. Sometimes the best way to help restless spirits find peace is simply to remember them. Carol took my suggestion seriously. A small plaque now hangs near the entrance to Ashley's Tavern, telling the story of Ethel Allen and the boarding house that once occupied the site. The supernatural incident stopped immediately after the plaque was installed. I have been back to Ashley's Tavern several times since that day, both for follow-up inspections and as a regular customer. The atmosphere is completely different now. The building feels lighter, more welcoming, as if a great weight has been lifted from its foundation. The women's bathroom, once a source of fear for female patrons, now feels like any other part of the restaurant. Staff members report no more unexplained accidents or equipment failures. The staircase to the second floor is safe and stable, with no more mysterious falls. But sometimes, on quiet afternoons when the restaurant is nearly empty, I catch a glimpse of something in my peripheral vision. Not threatening or frightening, just a presence that feels protective and grateful. Ethel Allen may have moved on to whatever comes after death, but part of her remains to watch over the place where she spent her final moments. The man from the photograph is gone forever. His unnatural existence finally ended by the courage of the woman he thought he had silenced. Evil may be powerful, but it cannot endure indefinitely when confronted by truth and justice, even if that confrontation takes 90 years to unfold. Ashley's Tavern is still considered one of the most haunted restaurants in America, but the haunting has changed from something malevolent to something peaceful. Ethel Allen no longer appears in mirrors or bathrooms, desperately trying to warn people of danger. Instead, she rests quietly in the foundations of the building she called home, finally free from the man who stole her life and tried to steal her death as well. And sometimes, just sometimes, the staff will find a wine glass that has been carefully placed in exactly the right spot, or a table that has been set with particular care, as if gentle hands are still looking after the customers who visit her final resting place. Justice delayed is not justice denied. Sometimes it just takes longer than we expect, and requires more courage than we knew we possessed. But in the end, truth has a way of surfacing, even from the deepest graves. And the dead, when they are finally heard, can rest at last. Story 10. Fourth woman. I know what happened to the Springfield 3. I know because I was supposed to be the fourth woman who disappeared that night in June 1992. My name is Jennifer Walsh, and this is the first time I've told anyone the complete truth about what really happened on Delmar Street. Everyone knows the basic story. 3 women vanished from a suburban home in Springfield, Missouri. Susie Streeter, 19, fresh from her high school graduation party. Stacy McCall, 18, her best friend who was supposed to spend the night at my house instead. And Cheryl Levitt, 47, Susie's mother, who was home alone when the girls decided to crash there after their original plans fell through. What people don't know is that I was invited too. What they don't know is that something was hunting us that night, something that had been watching and waiting for the perfect moment to take what it needed. And what they definitely don't know is that the Springfield 3 weren't the first to disappear, and they weren't the last. The night started normally enough. June 6, 1992. Kickapoo High School graduation parties scattered across Springfield like confetti. I was at one with Stacy and Susie, celebrating the end of our senior year, making plans for the summer before we all went our separate ways to college. The air was thick with Missouri humidity and teenage excitement. Around 11 p.m., we were trying to figure out where to spend the night. The original plan had been my house, but my parents had friends visiting from out of state, and the guest situation was complicated. Stacy suggested we all crash at her place, but her mother had relatives staying over too. That is when Susie mentioned her mom's house on Delmar Street. Here is where the official story gets it wrong. It wasn't a spontaneous decision. Someone called us at the party. Someone who knew exactly where we were and exactly what we were planning. A woman's voice, older, claiming to be a friend of Cheryl, who said she was supposed to pass along a message that we were all welcome to stay at the Levitt house. I remember feeling uneasy about the call. Something in the woman's voice felt rehearsed, like she was reading from a script. But Stacy and Susie were already excited about the plan, and I didn't want to be the one to complicate things over a feeling. The drive to Delmar Street should have taken 15 minutes. Instead, we got lost. Not just turned around, but genuinely lost in a part of Springfield we all knew by heart. Streets that should have connected to main roads ended into fields. Traffic lights that had been at the same intersections for years were suddenly missing. Street signs pointed in directions that didn't make sense. Stacy was driving, and I could see her getting frustrated in the rearview mirror. We'd driven past the same gas station 3 times, but each time it looked slightly different. First time, the lights were on and there were cars in the lot. Second time, the building looked older. The sign faded. Third time, the windows were boarded up like it had been abandoned for years. That's when I started paying attention to things that didn't add up. The radio kept cutting to static at exactly the same spot in songs, always right before the chorus. The digital clock on the dashboard was moving backwards, losing minutes instead of gaining them. And there were other cars following the same strange routes we were, driving in circles through neighborhoods that seemed to shift when we weren't looking directly at them. We finally found Delmar Street around 1 in the morning, 2 hours later than it should have taken. The house was a modest 2-story in a quiet residential area, the kind of neighborhood where nothing unusual ever happened. Cheryl's car was in the driveway, and the porch light was on like she was expecting us. But as we pulled up, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. Every house on the street had the same car parked outside. Not the same model or color, but literally the exact same vehicle. Same license plate, same small dent in the front bumper, same parking position. Like someone had copied and pasted the same car up and down the entire block. I mentioned this to Stacy and Susie, but when they looked, all they saw were normal cars. Different makes, different years, nothing unusual, but I could still see the identical vehicles, lined up like chess pieces waiting for someone to make the first move. We knocked on the front door, and Cheryl answered immediately, as if she'd been standing right there waiting. She looked exactly like I expected from Susie's descriptions, but something about her expression felt wrong. Too welcoming, too eager, like she was performing the role of a friendly mother rather than actually being one. The house felt wrong too, not dirty or damaged, but somehow hollow. Our footsteps echoed too much in the living room. The furniture looked like it belonged in a showroom rather than a home where people actually live. Family photos on the wall showed faces that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. Cheryl offered us snacks and drinks, playing the perfect hostess. But I noticed she never ate or drank anything herself. And whenever one of us asked her a direct question about herself or her life, she would deflect with questions about us. Our families, our plans, our secrets. The conversation felt like an interview disguised as small talk. Cheryl wanted to know about our relationships with our parents, our fears about the future, our deepest regrets. Information that seemed innocent but felt invasive in ways I couldn't articulate. Around 2 a.m., I excused myself to use the bathroom. The hallway upstairs was longer than it should have been, with more doors than I had counted from outside the house. I passed what looked like a child's bedroom, but the toys inside were wrong somehow. Too old, too worn, like they had been played with by generations of children who were no longer there. In the bathroom, I splashed cold water on my face and tried to shake off the feeling that we had made a terrible mistake coming here. That's when I heard voices from downstairs. Not conversation, but whispering. Urgent, secretive whispering in a language that sounded almost like English but wasn't quite right. I crept to the top of the stairs and listened. The whispering was coming from multiple sources, more voices than there were people in the house. They were discussing us by name, describing our physical characteristics, our personalities, our value for something they called the collection. One voice mentioned that they needed 4, that 3 wouldn't be enough for the ritual to work properly. Another voice said that the 4th one was proving resistant, that she might need additional convincing. They were talking about me. I realized that whatever was happening in this house, whatever had happened to create this situation, I was not supposed to leave. None of us were. We had been selected, gathered, and brought here for a specific purpose that had nothing to do with friendship or hospitality. Moving as quietly as possible, I made my way back down the hallway, looking for another way out. The window at the end of the hall showed a view that didn't match what I had seen from outside. Instead of the neighboring houses, I could see an endless field of tall grass stretching to the horizon, lit by a moon that was too large and too bright. The child's bedroom I had passed earlier now had its door open. Inside, instead of toys, there were photographs covering every surface. Hundreds of photographs of young women, all around our age, all smiling the same empty smile. Some of the photos looked decades old, others more recent, but all of the women looked similar enough to be sisters. All of them looked like us. I found a back staircase that led to the kitchen. From there, I could hear the voices more clearly. They weren't coming from the living room where I had left my friends. They were coming from below, from a basement I hadn't known existed. The basement door was slightly ajar, and warm air was flowing up from below. Air that smelled like flowers and decay, like a funeral home trying to mask something rotten with too much perfume. I knew I should run. Every instinct was screaming at me to get out of the house. Get to a phone, call for help. But I couldn't leave Stacy and Susie. Whatever was happening here, they were part of it now. And I was the only one who understood the danger. The basement steps were wooden, old, and they creaked under my weight. I tried to distribute my steps to minimize the sound, but each footfall seemed to echo like a gunshot in the enclosed space. The basement was much larger than the house could contain, stretching beyond what should have been the foundation walls. The ceiling was higher too, supported by stone columns that looked ancient, like they belonged in a cathedral rather than a suburban home. At the center of the space was a circle drawn on the concrete floor with what looked like chalk but glowed faintly in the dim light. Inside the circle were 3 chairs, and in those chairs were 3 figures I almost didn't recognize. Stacy, Susie, and Cheryl sat perfectly still, their eyes open but unfocused, staring at something I couldn't see. Their faces were relaxed, peaceful, like they were sleeping with their eyes open. But there was something wrong with their skin, a translucent quality that made them look like they were fading away. Around the circle stood several people I had never seen before, but who felt familiar somehow. They were dressed in ordinary clothes, the kind of outfits you see at a grocery store or shopping mall, but their faces were too smooth, too symmetrical, like they had been assembled rather than born. One of them noticed me and turned. When she smiled, I recognized the voice that had called us at the graduation party. She explained without being asked, her words appearing in my mind rather than reaching my ears through the air. The Springfield 3 case, she told me, was a cover story. A way to explain disappearances that happened regularly, disappearances that were necessary for something much larger than local crime statistics. The women in the chairs weren't dead, she assured me. They were transitioning, becoming part of something eternal, something beautiful, something that would preserve their youth and beauty forever. But the process required 4 participants, and I was disrupting the balance by maintaining my resistance. She gestured to the walls around us, and I realized they were covered with more photographs. Hundreds more. Women from different decades, different eras, all captured at the same age, all wearing the same peaceful expression as my friends in the circle. This had been happening for generations, she explained. Young women were selected based on specific criteria. Their age, their friendships, their potential for preservation. They were gathered at moments of transition in their lives, when they were most vulnerable to suggestion and most likely to be missed only gradually. The Springfield 3 case had received unusual attention, more publicity than was comfortable for the process. But that attention had also provided perfect cover for future selections. People expected young women to disappear in Springfield. The mystery had become part of the local culture, making it easier to continue the work without suspicion. I asked what would happen if I refused to join the circle, if I tried to leave or call for help. The woman's smile became sharper, less human. She showed me scenes from other attempts to resist. Women who had tried to run found themselves lost in neighborhoods that shifted like mazes, always leading back to the same house. Women who had tried to call for help discovered that their calls connected to voices they recognized, voices of friends and family members who encouraged them to return, to complete what they had started. The process, she explained, was much easier when participants chose to cooperate. Resistance only prolonged the discomfort and made the transition more difficult for everyone involved. But there was something else, something she hadn't expected me to notice. The photographs on the walls weren't just documentation of previous selections. They were trophies, evidence of successful hunts. And in the corner, almost hidden behind a support column, was a photograph that made everything clear. It was a picture of the woman who was speaking to me, but she was wearing clothes from the 1940s. And she looked exactly the same age as she did now. Exactly the same face, the same hair, the same predatory smile. She wasn't just the hunter. She had been the prey once too, decades ago. And now she was part of the mechanism that sustained itself by consuming others. I understood then that this wasn't about preservation or eternal beauty. It was about feeding something that couldn't exist without regular offerings of youth and life force. The women in the photographs hadn't been preserved. They had been consumed, their essence used to maintain the existence of something that should have died long ago. The realization must have shown on my face, because the woman's expression changed. The pretense of kindness disappeared, replaced by something cold and calculating. She told me I had a choice. I could join my friends in the circle, participate in the transition willingly, and become part of something larger than myself. Or I could resist, and they would take what they needed anyway, but the process would be much more unpleasant for everyone involved. I looked at Stacy and Susie, sitting peacefully in their chairs, already halfway gone. I thought about their families, who would spend years wondering what happened, filing missing person reports, hoping for news that would never come. And I made my choice. I told the woman I would cooperate, but I needed a moment to say goodbye to my old life, to mentally prepare myself for the transition. She seemed pleased with my reasonable attitude and gestured for me to approach the circle. Instead, I grabbed the nearest heavy object, a piece of broken concrete from the basement floor, and threw it as hard as I could at one of the glowing symbols that marked the boundary of the circle. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The symbols flared with bright light, then went dark. The people standing around the circle stumbled backward, their two perfect faces contorting with pain. And my friends in the chairs suddenly gasped, their eyes focusing for the first time since I had found them. But we weren't safe yet. Whatever power had been sustaining the basement space was failing, and the room began to collapse around us. The stone columns cracked, the ceiling sagged, and the walls started closing in. I grabbed Stacy and Susie, pulling them from their chairs, shouting at them to run. They were weak, disoriented, but survival instinct kicked in and they followed me toward the stairs. The woman who had been speaking to me was screaming now, her voice no longer human, filled with rage and desperation. She and the others were changing, their carefully maintained appearances dissolving to reveal something much older and much less human underneath. We made it to the kitchen as the basement caved in completely. The house was shaking, plaster falling from the ceiling, windows cracking. Whatever had been maintaining the illusion of normalcy was breaking down completely. Outside, the street was chaos. The identical cars were gone, replaced by empty spaces and confused neighbors emerging from their houses to investigate the noise. The too large moon had returned to normal size, and the endless field visible from the upstairs window was now just a normal view of suburban Springfield. We ran to Stacy's car and drove straight to the police station. We told them about finding Stacy and Susie in the basement, about the collapse, about Cheryl Levitt being trapped inside. We left out the parts about supernatural predators and decades of disappearances. The official investigation found no trace of Cheryl Levitt in the ruins of the basement. They found no evidence of the photographs, the ritual circle, or the other figures we had encountered. The case was classified as a home invasion gone wrong, with Cheryl presumed dead and her body lost in the structural collapse. Stacy and Susie recovered physically, but they never remembered anything from that night after arriving at the Delmar Street house. The doctors said it was trauma-induced amnesia, a protective mechanism that helped them cope with whatever they had experienced. I never told them the truth. How could I explain that they had been selected for consumption by something that fed on young women, this life force? How could I make them understand that they had been saved by pure luck and the structural instability of a decades-old supernatural trap? But the story doesn't end there. It never ends. Over the years, they tracked similar cases across the country. Young women disappearing in groups, often during moments of transition or celebration. Cases that received just enough publicity to become local mysteries but never enough investigation to reveal the truth. The Springfield 3 case became famous because something went wrong that night, because the process was interrupted before it could be completed. But in most cases, nobody interrupts anything. The selections happen quietly, efficiently, and the women simply vanish into the collection. They tried to warn people, tried to publicize the pattern, tried to get law enforcement to recognize the connections between cases. But who would believe a story about supernatural predators masquerading as suburban housewives? Who would take seriously a claim that some missing persons cases are actually feeding operations for entities that shouldn't exist? The truth is hidden in plain sight, disguised as unsolved mysteries and cold cases. The Springfield 3 weren't the first, and they weren't the last. They were just the most visible failure of a system that has been operating successfully for generations. And I know it's still operating because last week, I got a phone call. A woman, its voice, older, familiar, claiming to be organizing a reunion for survivors of the Springfield 3 case. She knew details about that night that were never made public, details that only someone who was there could know. She has found me again. After 30 years, whatever survived the collapse of the house on Delmar Street has tracked me down. It wants to complete what it started, wants to finish the collection that was interrupted all those years ago. The difference is that now I know what I'm dealing with. Now I'm prepared, and now I have a story that might warn others about what is really happening in small towns across America. What is really behind the cases that never get solved. So if you ever find yourself invited to spend the night somewhere you've never been, by someone you don't really know, in a situation that feels too convenient to be coincidental, remember the Springfield 3. Remember that some disappearances aren't due to random crimes or tragic accidents. Sometimes they reharvests, and sometimes you ruin the crop.